This is the day the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. This morning, this Bible passage that is the basis for this morning's message is the Bible reading from Luke chapter 7, the gospel reading. Dear brothers and sisters in Christ, why do we come here every week? Is it just to sit in this beautiful air-conditioned building? Is it to hear the organ music and sing the hymns? Is it just to see the people that we miss during the week? Is it because there are people that would be disappointed if we weren't here? Is it because this is what's expected of us, what good people do? Is it because we're getting paid to be here? Is it because this is just what we always do? Or is it because of Jesus? Now, if you're anything like me, that maybe you're feeling a little bit guilty right now, or at least a little bit defensive, because you know that your motivations for the things that you do are not always what they should be. Whether your motives for being here this morning are good or bad or just indifferent, what matters is that you are here now. And ultimately, you're here not because you wanted to be here, but because God wanted you here. Because God has something to say to you today. You and I are here today, this morning, because we are guilty. We're guilty in obvious ways. We are guilty in not so obvious ways. We're guilty whether or not we admit it. God has brought us here today because each of us owes him a debt that desperately needs paying. And so that's why this morning we focus on that question: how do I, as a Christian, deal with my guilt? So listen again to the first few verses of Luke chapter 7. When one of the Pharisees invited Jesus to have dinner with him, he went to the Pharisee's house and reclined at the table. A woman in that town who lived a sinful life learned that Jesus was eating at the Pharisee's house, so she came there. How do people deal with guilt? Or maybe an easier question: how do you deal with your guilt? Maybe you think the wrong thing, you have this awful thought, maybe you just say something wrong or do something wrong, and somebody points out your mistake, or maybe it's just your conscience that nags at you. But how do you deal with that? Now, maybe you hear this account, and at first it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to you. Maybe it's a different culture, it's a different time. And on the surface, maybe you hear it the first time and it just seems a little bit, strange. But if we can have the patience to set aside those cultural differences and to just listen to what God has to say to us in this account, we'll see that it has just as much relevance to us today as it did when it happened. It shows us these two types of people, the Pharisee and the sinner. Now, the Pharisee was this person who was, everybody considered the good guy. A Pharisee belonged to this powerful party within first century Jewish society that was dedicated. They had committed their lives to doing everything that God wanted them to do as well as they possibly could. So they followed the Ten Commandments, and so they followed all these other rules that God had given them to govern their community and their worship. They cared so much about doing that they even made up their own rules for following God. They made up hundreds of different rules that God had never really said to do, but they were so concerned about following him. And the result, as it is with many any self-righteous form of Christianity today, is that the Pharisee was completely unbearable. They thought themselves better than everybody else. They looked down on everyone. They were arrogant and they were cold, many of them. They didn't think they owed anything to God. If anything, they thought God might owe them something for everything that they had done for him. So you have the Pharisee. And then there's this woman. This woman whose only identifying mark for most of this account is that she is a sinner. She hadn't cared about what God wanted for her life. She just did whatever she wanted, and everybody in that town where Jesus was knew exactly what she had done. She was the type of person that people were embarrassed to be seen in the same room as. A Pharisee and a sinner. And in these two people, to one degree or another, you have the two ways in which people naturally deal with guilt. So if somebody is a Pharisee, they deal with guilt by trying to outrun it. They try to do so much good that it outweighs whatever bad they might have done, so they don't have to think about it. They have the self-control to know what the right thing is to do, and oftentimes to do that thing. And they look down sometimes on people who maybe don't do the right thing or aren't so concerned with being good. They're what we would consider the good people, what most people would consider the good people. But God isn't fooled by that. So what would there be to accuse somebody like that of? Well, just look at their hearts. They despise people. They look down on people, people that God has commanded them to love. Guilty. They may do the right thing, but that doesn't always mean that they want to do the right thing. And for example, it might strike them as unfair that somebody else would get away with something wrong, maybe because they would do the same thing if they could just get away with it. Or secretly, they want to do the same thing. What does that tell you about their hearts? Guilty. The Pharisee tries to outrun guilt, tries to do so much good that they don't have to think about the little bad that they do or the evil that is on their hearts. And if somebody's a sinner, on the other hand, they deal with guilt by trying to embrace it. They try not to care so much about what's right and wrong. They don't have the self-control of a Pharisee, and it shows. They look down on people who care about doing the right thing. Guilty. Their guilt is obvious, but it doesn't bother them so much. Guilty. And you and I, naturally, we would be Pharisees or sinners still today if Jesus hadn't said something different. Listen as the reading continues. Jesus answered the Pharisee, "Simon, I have something to tell you." "Tell me, teacher," he said. Two people owed money to a certain moneylender. One owed him 500 denarii, the other 50. Neither of them had the money to pay him back. So when the Bible uses words to describe people, a lot of times the word that they use tells us something that's important about that person in that moment. So up until this point in the account, the man has only been known as a Pharisee. That tells you something about him. The woman has only been known as this sinner. That tells you something about her. But now, Jesus goes beyond just what people see when they look at a person. And he calls these two people by the same name: debtors. This man and this woman who are so different. This man with his sophisticated look and his spotless reputation. This woman with her tears and her shame. Jesus calls them by the same name: debtors. people who owed something to God, owed a debt to God, whether big or small, people who could not pay that debt back. That woman, because her debt was so great, she could so easily see her guilt. But ironically, the man was trying so hard to be good that it blinded him to the reality of his own heart and the guilt that was there. Well, you know that you're guilty too, right? So am I. Look around. Whether in a white robe or a suit or a dress or a t-shirt, every one of us here today is guilty, is a debtor, somebody who owes God a debt that we couldn't ever possibly repay. But here is where we see the grace of Jesus. A woman in that town who lived a sinful life learned that Jesus was eating at the Pharisee's house, so she came there with an alabaster jar of perfume. As she stood behind him at his feet, weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears. And she wiped them with her hair, kissed them, and poured perfume on them. When the Pharisee who had invited Jesus saw this, he said to himself, "If this man were a prophet, he would know who is touching him and what kind of woman she is, that she is a sinner." The Pharisee despised Jesus. Why? Because he saw Jesus letting this sinner touch him. Jesus let the tears of this sinful woman fall on his feet. He let her brush his feet with her hair. He let her kiss his feet and pour perfume on them. And this self-righteous, this ultra-religious, this good guy thought to himself, this man could not possibly know who this woman is, or he would never let her do that. But Jesus did know. Jesus knew exactly who that woman was, and he loved her anyways. Jesus let this woman with a screwed up life, with the shameful reputation, let her tears fall on his feet. Who's like that? Jesus makes the best of us pale in comparison to him. Because for all of his power and for all his purity and his absolute rightness, Jesus was not ashamed to come into this world and to embrace people who had spent their whole lives just trying to get away from him. He was not ashamed to come into this world and to let the tears of sinners fall on his feet, and to say to people who are overcome with guilt, "You are forgiven." And he loved Simon too. And so he told him the truth. And Simon didn't want to hear it, but he told him anyway. And he says to us at our most Pharisaical, "You are guilty. Admit it. You're guilty. What are you so afraid of? Just admit it. You are wrong, but you're forgiven." Jesus saw that woman, and he loved her in spite of who she was. And he saw Simon, and he loved him too in spite of who he was. And he sees us. He sees you. And he loves you in spite of whatever is on your heart and whatever is you have done with your hands. He has taken your entire debt away. Whatever you owe to God, it's gone. Not for nothing, but because Jesus has paid the price for that debt. He shed his blood. He suffered hell for you. He saw who you were, and he made you see that too, and then he made you something else entirely. The rest assured today and every day that your guilt, whatever you owe to God, has been taken away. And remember, too, that whatever we were when we came into this room this morning, we're the same now. Me, you, the person behind you, the person next to you, the person you like, the person you don't like, the person you're disappointed by, the person who has disappointed or who you've disappointed. We are all the same. Debtors, grateful to owe everything to the God who loves us more than anything. So having faith in that promise of forgiveness, let's forgive each other. Let's move past failures. Let's forgive present failures. Let's deal gently with the Pharisee and comfort the person stricken by guilt. Let's come here week after week to hear God say, or to say to God, first of all, I am guilty, I admit it, and to hear him say to us, you are forgiven. And then let's go out into this community and let's live as the forgiven children of God that we are. And whatever your calling, whether as a parent or a child or whatever your job is, or if you're a student, whatever God has called you to do this week, live as the forgiven children of God that you are. And it's not going to be perfect, but it doesn't have to be, because Jesus has done that for you. So how do we answer that question? That question that started this sermon. How do I, as a Christian, deal with my guilt? I freely admit it. I am guilty, but in Jesus, I am forgiven. Amen.